So now that you've seen how to make a component, we're going to make something a little bit more practical and useful. It's not very useful to use this component because it's always going to be the same. It's not dynamic. We need some way to make this a little bit more dynamic and reusable. What I'm going to do is repurpose my hello component to be called num, and we're going to see what this is going to do in just a moment. The next thing we're going to need to do is register this component, so I'm just going to call it num and pass it in here. What we're going to do is build a reusable abstraction. Instead of having all the complexity to do with numbers in the main application component, we're going to move it into our num component. So the first thing we're going to do is start by seeing how we can pass data from a parent, for example the number, into a child component, such as the one we're declaring up here. So let's go ahead and do that. What we're going to do is move this syntax interpolation up into our template. So I'm going to grab this number, come up to the top, and we're going to replace this with our number, which we're going to somehow find a way to pass from the parent to the child. I'm also going to make this div just to make it a little bit cleaner. So now that we have that, we need some way to access this number in our child component from the parent. And if we were to go and try and use this without having that passing value, it's not going to work. I'm going to jump inside here and just illustrate this by rendering a number component. And if we were to go and save this one off, head back to the browser, we can see we no longer have any numbers. If we jump into the inspector though and head down here, you can see we are rendering all the divs. We have 10 divs, one for each of the numbers, but we haven't got any content. We do have the class and the title, which is still over here. So we need to have some way to pass this number into this component. And this is very similar to what you do with a function and pass some variables. And the way you do this is just by binding to what's called a property. And the way we do this is by typing the name of the property. I'm going to call it number, and we're just going to set it to be the number. Again, we need to use the colon because we're going to be interacting with some JavaScript. What this is going to do is realize this is a JavaScript expression. In this case, it's a number. It's going to evaluate it, so it's going to return the correct number, and it's going to assign it to this number property here. And now what we can do is tell the child component we're going to be receiving this number property. The way you do that is by declaring a new option we haven't seen yet called props. And this is short for properties. And what we're going to do here is just tell the component all the properties it's going to be receiving from the parent component. In this case, it's going to receive a property called number, and we can put some extra information in here as well. I'm going to say the type is a number, and this is just going to make it easier for the user to understand what they can do with your component. We're also going to pass in required, and that's going to say you absolutely have to require this number if you're going to use this component. Now that we have all of that, if we save this off and head back to the browser, this is actually going to work. You can see we have all our numbers rendered. So everything is working exactly the same. But what we've done is move the complexity out of the main application, and we've moved it into a custom component, which we can then reuse across our application. This is a little confusing to me at first, and I'm just going to emphasize how this works. The name of this on the left-hand side has to match up to whatever you pass into your component up here in the props attribute. Just to illustrate this, I'm going to rename this from number. I'm going to call it ASDF. And this, of course, is not going to work anymore. If I save it off and head back to the browser, it's not rendering those numbers anymore. If I do update this prop to match up and say ASDF, and then we change this to be ASDF as well, this is going to work. Everything is now working as expected. And as you can see, much like data, methods, and computed properties, props are also automatically available in the template. I'm going to revert that to be number because it makes a little bit more sense. And now the next thing we're going to do is move the complexity of figuring out the correct class into this component as well. So what I'm going to do is grab this getClass function from down here, and we're going to move this up into our number component. Let's head up there and put it in here. So we're going to create a new methods key. I'm just going to create that below the template. I like to keep my methods at the bottom of my components, and we're going to drop this one in here. If we save this off, we're going to see an error. So what we're going to do first is grab the getClass call and move it into our component as well. So I'm just going to grab this one, cut it, and then drop it into my template on line 11. If we save this one off, you might expect this to work, but we're going to see there's going to be a problem. Let's go ahead and refresh the browser, and we're getting an error. And the error is the isEven function is not defined. You can see isEven is being called here, but we define that in our parent component, so it's not going to be available. We are going to see a way to recycle functions across all our components, but for now what I'm going to do is head down to my main application. I'm just going to delete this one for now, we don't need this anymore. And I'm also going to delete this even list because we're not using it. Finally, I'm going to grab the isEven function and I'm going to move that up to my new component as well. So we're just going to add a new method here on line 21. Now that we have this, if we save it off, we have all the required functions. We have isEven and we have getClass. If I head over to my browser and refresh it, everything is now working again as expected. And this is definitely a good thing. We haven't changed any functionality, but we've made a very powerful abstraction. Any logic related to the numbers is going to be inside of this number component. And then whenever you need one of those in your application, all you need to do is drop a num and then bind the correct number in here. There is one further improvement we're going to make. We're going to remove this title binding. We don't need that one for now. And what we're going to do is eliminate this extra div. If we head over to our browser now, you can jump inside of here and we see we have two divs. We have this empty div on the outside, which corresponds to the div created by v4. And then we have a div on the inside, which is created by the number component. And that's not really necessary. What we're going to do is move our v4 loop from this div here, and we're actually able to use v4 on custom components as well. Let's go ahead and delete the extra divs and make sure this is still working. And you can see everything is still working, but if we jump into the inspector, you can see we haven't got that extra div anymore. And this is the point when I was learning Vue, I really felt the power of it, but I also felt quite confused, mainly because I had the word number here a whole bunch of times. And you will often see people call their components with the same name as well. So you have number. And this was a little bit confusing for me at first. I just like to emphasize what's going on here. We have this number variable here, and we're looping over it. So if I was to change this to ASDF, and as long as we bind to the correct value here, so I'm going to pass in ASDF is here, it's going to evaluate this JavaScript expression, return the correct number, and then we're telling the child component, you're going to receive a property called number. As long as this value, this number here matches up to this number up here, it's going to work correctly. So if we save this one off now, we're saying we're going to pass a value of ASDF, it's going to evaluate to a number, which is going to be bound to this variable, and then the component is going to receive a number prop, and we're going to then use that in our template. If we save this off, it's going to work as expected still. And just to further emphasize this, I'm going to update the name of the prop as well. We're just going to call this one, let's just call it QWER. And as long as this value here matches up to the one we're using in our template up here, everything is going to work as expected as well. Let's just try this one out and see if it's still working. And it is still working. Of course, this is very confusing, but you can see which values need to match up to make everything work. I'm going to undo all of this because it's a lot more easy to understand with number. And if you are a little confused by this, just try changing the names of the variables and see what works and what doesn't. But once you get used to this, it is very easy to read. You can just see all the numbers and the variables are set up here, and everything is working as you would expect. And what we've done here is create our first very powerful abstraction. A more realistic use case for this might be something like a custom button, for example, my button, and you might allow the user to pass some variables like a color or maybe a title or something like that. Another common thing is a load state, and that will set the button to be loading. And we're going to see how we can use it to create more customizable and reusable components in the future.